Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to today's Quantitative History Webinar. And I'm Sijie, and it is a great honor for me to be today's moderator. And we are very pleased and honored today to have with us Professor James Fenske. And Professor Fenske is a professor in the Department of Economics at the University of Warwick, and also a research associate at the Center for Competitive Advantage in the Global Economy at Warwick. And in today's talk, Professor Fenske will present his new joint work on a century of language barriers to migration in India. And we are very much looking forward to the talk. And we are also very pleased to have Professor Mark Harp as our discussant today. And Professor Harp is a research assistant professor in the Department of Economics at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. And we believe that his expertise, especially in economic history and also in migration, will no doubt bring valuable insights to today's discussion. And in terms of structure of the webinar today, Professor Fenske will deliver a 1 hour presentation followed by a 10-minute discussion by Professor Harp, and then we will open the floor for a Q&A session. So for our audience, please just feel free to submit your questions in the Q&A box. And we will relay as many questions as possible to Professor James Fenske in the Q&A session. Okay, so without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Fenske. And Professor Fenske, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you. Let me see if I can get my slides to share. And then let me see if I can get them to be full screen. All right. So what we're going to do in this paper is ask whether the diverse set of languages that exist within India are part of the explanation for why internal migration seems lower in India than you would expect, particularly compared to other peer countries. We're going to ask whether this is true in the recent past, and we're going to ask whether this is true more than a century ago. So why should you care? Well, we know that migration is extremely profitable, at least for the migrants, most of the time, in that often you can raise your wage considerably by moving to another country or to another part of the same country where wages are higher. But migration rates differ quite a bit across time and space, and in many cases are lower than you would expect them to be, given the economic benefits to the migrants. So there's a lot of potential explanations for this. Maybe this is all about credit constraints. Maybe it's all about a lack of information. But maybe it's about culture. Maybe I just don't like the food in the destination region. Maybe I can't speak the language in the destination region. And so we're not, obviously, going to be the first economists who have ever thought about language as a potential barrier to migration. However, much of the work that exists on whether language is a potential barrier to migration have focused on migration across countries, often across rich countries, or in the rare cases where they have looked within countries, a lot of that work has been within developed countries. So, for example, do two dialect regions within Germany see less migration between them than you would expect otherwise? Now, because transportation systems and communication systems and the education systems might be better in many developed countries, perhaps we're understating the degree to which language is a barrier to migration by only focusing or by disproportionately focusing on rich countries. It's also the case that language as a potential barrier could be substitutable to or could be complementary to other barriers that get removed with economic development of that change over time, transportation systems, education, that sort of thing. And so there's very little evidence out there on how language has evolved over time as a barrier to migration, particularly over the very long run. If we wanted to look at within-country migration, and if we wanted to look at how language has restricted within-country migration over time, India is really the place to do it. India has a large number of internal languages that are widely spoken, and some of them are very dissimilar from each other, coming from different language families. That sort of linguistic division often isn't found within European countries. But it's also a country that has a long history of the ability to measure both migration and language, because the colonial censuses and the modern day censuses are very similar in how they are constructed. It's also a country in which the rate of migration is something of a puzzle, because if you do league tables of what fraction of the population of migration age has moved within the last 10 years or so, you'll often find India towards the bottom of that sort of international league table. And so the puzzle of low migration in India is one worth looking at. So what we're going to do in this paper is build 2 data sets. We're actually going to build like 5 data sets, but I want you to focus on 2 of them at the start. One of these data sets is going to be for 1901. And so what we're going to have is based on the 1901 colonial census that we had to digitize ourselves the old-fashioned way, we're going to know the number of people born in an origin district O who are living in a destination district D. That's going to allow us to run gravity-style regressions where number of migrants from O to D is the dependent variable. But we're going to need to measure, in addition, the linguistic distances between districts. We're going to take the majority language at O and the majority language at D and ask, how dissimilar are they? Now, there's many different ways to measure the dissimilarity across languages, but what we're going to do is focus on how connected they are in a language tree. If, for example, Hindi is an Indo-European, Indo-Iranian, Indo-Aryan, Western Hindustani language, and I may have got those details wrong because I didn't write them down in front of me, that's going to be very related to other languages along that tree, say Punjabi, say Haryanvi, say Urdu, and it's not going to be related at all to a language like Tamil that's a Dravidian language. And so that's going to be how we build our baseline measure. We're going to do this for 1901, but we're also going to do this for 2001, 100 years later, using very similar measures of the number of people born in origin O who live in destination D. From that point onwards, the regression is going to look very obvious. It's going to look like a gravity-style regression where the number of migrants but from O to D is regressed on, in a Poisson sense, on the linguistic distance between O and D, origin fixed effects, destination fixed effects, and a bunch of other geographic dissimilarity measures that we have for, are these 2 districts neighbors? Are they far from each other? Are they both good at growing rice? Are their rainfall shocks correlated? Those sorts of observables. What we find in that 1901 sample is that in that regression, if I were to go from 2 languages speaking, or 2 districts speaking the same language, we both speak Hindi, to we speak completely unrelated languages, one speaks Hindi and one speaks Tamil, migration is going to fall by about 38%. Now, if you don't like that conditional on observables gravity-style regression approach, we're going to take a second approach. We're going to take an approach in which we look at migration across boundaries that separate languages and that in particular separate language families. That if you look at the border separating Indo-European languages in the north and Dravidian languages from the south, those cut in the colonial period all the way through existing colonial provinces, through existing administrative zones. And we can show you that migration falls off a cliff when you move south to north across the boundary between Kannada and Marathi, or if you go the other way back. And the ITT effect is going to be about 38% as well. Now, there have been many changes in South Asia since 1901. So our baseline regressions are going to include Pakistan and Bangladesh and even Burma. That's not what's going to drive any differences. We can get rid of non-modern India. But there have also been changes in the spread of English and the spread of education and economic development. And you might wonder whether language as a barrier to migration looks different in 2001 than it does in 1901. And we can show you that in the gravity type regressions that the impact of language on migration falls off a cliff all the way from 38% to 36%, by which I mean it hasn't fallen at all. Language appears to be as much of a barrier to migration in 2001 as it does in the colonial censuses in 1901. So why? Why could language be a barrier to migration? It could be a proxy for other existing cultural differences. Maybe it's correlated with religion, maybe it's correlated with cultural practices. We don't think that's what's driving our results. And we think really this is about the ability to communicate. Can I find a job? Can I talk to the doctor? Can I get the right price in the local market? And we're going to give you really three pieces of evidence that this is about language qua language. One is that we're able to, with rather sparse colonial data on wages, show that language is a barrier to migration most between district pairs where the destination has a higher wage than the origin. Next, what we're going to show you is that it's really about high-level distinctions, Hindi versus Tamil, rather than lower, narrower distinctions, say Hindi versus Bhojpuri, that drive these results. And so some of this is about the ability to get by and sort of understand that other language. Some of it's about the ability to learn a more similar language. But that, again, doesn't suggest culture. That suggests language and communication for their own sake. Lastly, we can only do this in the present day. We can't do this in the colonial period. We're going to be able to show you both languages spoken as mother tongues and languages spoken as second and third languages. And in that horse race style regression, it's the languages that you actually speak that drive migration rather than dissimilarities in mother tongues across districts. So conditional on us telling you that, what do I think we're telling you that you haven't seen before? Well, as I said, we are not the first paper in economics to think about language and migration. But a lot of the literature out there that focuses on language and migration focuses on international migration and often focuses on richer countries. There is now developing literature on internal migration, and we've got a bit of evidence from Germany from different dialects, a bit of evidence from Indonesia. And the sad thing about being tenured is you're incentivized to work slowly. When we started this project, there wasn't a language and migration paper on India. Now there is a paper on language and migration in India, and she finds results similar to what we find in the present day. But we also look at the past. We introduce an RDD that's novel to this literature, and we've got a lot of data on other cultural differences, on other measures of dissimilarity across districts. We can bring more evidence on mechanisms than already exists in the literature, so we're contributing something there. There's another literature out there on how linguistic diversity affects economic development. And so this is a literature that finds mechanisms in both directions. So if we are a country full of very dissimilar groups, do we disagree on public goods and thus end up with not very many public goods at all, or public goods that favor one group rather than favoring economic development? On the other hand, it could be the case that more diverse countries come up with more ideas and so grow more as a result. More diverse teams are often more productive. I think what we're going to be able to do in this paper is give you results that are going to anger both the left and the right. We're going to tell you that diversity is bad because it leads to too little migration. And you can think of this in a misallocation sense. If labor can't go where its marginal productivity is highest, language can be a barrier to development because it leads to misallocation of an important input. Lastly, there is a literature focused relatively specifically on India that asks why it appears that internal migration in India is so low, both in the past and in the present. And it's a literature that's focused on things like, if I move out of my village, I lose my caste network as a source of informal insurance. Or it could be that I lose access to public goods, or it could be that it's related to the quality of infrastructure. We add to this literature by focusing on language as an explanation that hasn't received that much attention and on its persistence as a barrier over the course of something like a century. So, what's the least that you need to know about migration in India to understand our paper? What you really want to understand is that migration was low in the past, and migration internally was low in the present, is low in the present, at least up to about the 2011 census. They haven't released the 2021 census yet. So if you were to look in the 1881 census, something like 95% of people were surveyed in their districts of birth. That is, they hadn't moved. If you were to do the same thing in later colonial censuses going up to 1931, you'd find that, sure, mobility appears to have risen somewhat, but about 90% of Indians were still surveyed in their birth districts. Now, that's not to say Indians didn't move. That's just to say that per capita rates of migration were relatively low. And so when Indians did move in India, where did they move? They often moved as laborers to work on infrastructure projects like railways, sometimes in response to major events like the famines of the late 19th century, they would move around, and they engaged in seasonal labor. The way the colonial censuses that we're going to use are structured, we are going to be able to capture seasonal labor as long as somebody's living in the destination on census day. If you were going to move, and you were going to move far enough that you moved outside your village, where did you go? Well, typically to the next district. That 2/3 of people who are enumerated outside the district that they're born in are born in an adjacent district. And that's going to mean that in our regressions, we're going to have to carry around a neighboring district dummy as an obvious control over and above controlling for distances between districts. Who's sending migrants? The poor and densely populated districts where wages are low. And where are people moving to? Well, to places with relatively higher wages. Think tea plantations in Assam, or think to the big presidency cities, Mumbai, Kolkata. Now, not all migration was for economic reasons or narrowly economic reasons, and language need not necessarily be a barrier only to economic migration. And so particularly in the North, with the practice of patrilocal exogamy, women leave their village of birth to go to the household of the groom on marriage. However, a lot of this migration is not very far. Much of it is still within the same district or to neighboring districts. Since 1991, mobility has increased in India, particularly with economic liberalization. However, I can't give you exact numbers that look like what I'm showing you in the first bullet of this slide. They've asked the question a little bit differently, but less than 10% of people of migration age have moved within the last 10 years, at least according to data from 2015. And so migration rates still seem relatively low in international comparison. What's the least you need to know about language in India to understand the paper that I'm presenting today? Well, the first thing you need to know is that India has a lot of languages. If we were to look in the modern day languages and ask modern day censuses and ask free form questions, people will give you thousands of answers to what language do you speak, which the government will narrow down to hundreds of standardized responses. If you were to look in the 1901 census, there's 147 languages that are actually checked off. These generally fall into four major groups. The Indo-European languages, think Hindi, think Punjabi, think Haryanvi, are largely in the north and in the northwest. This is going to be the largest group of speakers in the country. Dravidian languages, things like Malayalam, things like Tamil, are generally found in the south, in places like modern-day Kerala, places like modern-day Tamil Nadu. And then there's two other families that are much smaller in their representation. So Sino-Tibetan languages often exist in the Himalayan regions up in the north and in the northeast. And Austroasiatic languages are kind of in pockets throughout the country, often in the middle. The genetic evidence suggests that these are actually languages that came in from Southeast Asia more than 1,000 years ago. How much linguistic diversity does India have? Like, is it one big language and then lots and lots of little languages? Well, no. We think Indian linguistic diversity is pretty high. If you were to do a Herfindahl index and ask what's the probability that if I randomly grab one person from anywhere in India and then at random grab another person, what's the probability they speak different languages? Well, in 1901, that number would be 90%. If I were to look in 2001, despite the fact that there's no more Pakistan as part of India, despite the fact that there's no more Bangladesh as part of India, despite the fact that there's no more Burma as part of India, and despite the fact that the government promotes Hindi, I'd still get a probability of almost 90% that two randomly selected people speak different languages. Now, that number might sound high to you, and it hinges on something that's going to be of somewhat importance for mechanisms. We're not saying that 43% of the country speaks Hindi. We're saying that closer to 23% of the country speaks Hindi today because we're coding languages like Haryanvi and Bhojpuri as different languages. But when we get to the mechanism section, we'll start showing you that those kind of lower level divisions aren't what works as a barrier to migration. Now, hopefully, the bottom half of this slide is going to be the most controversial thing that I say today, because a lot of what we know about the origins of these languages is based on fairly new evidence that combines archaeology with genetics. And so if you were to go to India at the time of the Harappan civilization, you'd find, well, probably a lot of Dravidian speakers. And we think that because the undeciphered script has many similarities to modern day Southern Indian languages. There's no genetic evidence linking the ancient remains we have from Harappan and peripheral Harappan sites to steppe ancestry. But from about 2100 BC onwards, you start seeing Indo-European speakers moving in from Central Asia, and you see them becoming more represented genetically in populations of the north as Dravidian speakers end up more concentrated in the south. What we know about Austroasiatic and Sino-Tibetan languages is that those also seem to be coming in a long time ago. What's the point of all of this? The point of all of this is that we're going to take language as given. We're going to worry that it's potentially correlated with other things, and so we're going to control for observables. We're going to have an RDD approach that controls for unobservables, we hope. But we're not going to worry about migration leading to differences in language because we think a lot of those boundaries were fixed as far back in time as we can measure them. And that's also why we're going to use majority languages of districts rather than the full spectrum of languages that exists in an origin and destination pair. I'll say more about that later. So here's what it looks like on a map. That if you were to look in the north in orange, you'd see the Indo-European languages. This is by the most spoken language in a district in 1901. I keep saying majority. I should say plurality, but for more than 90% of cases, the plurality language is a majority language. And so you can see Indo-European languages being spoken widely throughout the north. In blue, you see Dravidian languages. In the south, the Sino-Tibetan language that's going to feature most in our 1901 regressions is going to be Burmese. And you can see a couple pockets of places where an Austroasiatic language is the most spoken language in a district, but obviously it's one of the smaller groups. So how are we going to measure differences between districts in the languages that they speak. What we're going to start off with is a free-form list of languages from the 1901 census. These are going to have names like Canarese instead of Kannada. And so we're going to have to crosswalk those to standardized codes that give standardized names to languages. Namrata Kala and I did this in a paper a few years ago where we were looking at market integration. In order to measure how dissimilar languages are, we're going to measure how many branches in common they have in a language tree. So for example, Hindi and Tamil, one is Indo-European, one is Dravidian, they're going to have no branches in common. Whereas Hindi and English are going to have one branch in common because they're both Indo-European. Hindi and Farsi are going to have two branches in common. Hindi and Punjabi are going to have three branches in common. And so the more branches you have in common, the more similar you are. Following work by people like Enrico Spallari and Roman Vaisiarg, what we're going to do is measure the linguistic distance between any two languages, a language M and a language N, and say that if you have no branches in common, you have a distance of 1. But the more branches you have in common, we will subtract off from that a fraction. A fraction where the numerator is 15 because the most branches any two languages can have in common in the entire ethnologue data set is 15. And we're going to allow for non-linearities. There's a bit of choice in this literature about what delta you should choose to allow for non-linearities. But if we choose 0.5, we allow for things like the distance between Punjabi and Hindi to be a meaningful difference rather than a meaningless difference. In our baseline, what we're going to do is say that Ludhiana is majority Punjabi speaking and Lucknow is majority Hindi speaking, or possibly Awadhi speaking. And we're going to take those majority languages to measure the distances between districts. The reason we're going to do that is because it's going to prevent reverse causation. Imagine I have a Rajasthani district and a few Marwaris move from that district to a Hindi-speaking district. Now there's a small Marwari-speaking population in that district. I don't want that to confound our measures of the linguistic distances between districts. So we're going to focus in the baseline on plurality languages. However, we can also, for robustness, use, if I were to grab one person at random from this district and one person at random from that district, what's the expected distance between their languages? And that's the formula you see at the bottom of this slide. You can think of it as almost a Herfindahl, but weighted by the distance between two people rather than just a dummy for whether their languages are different. How are we going? Okay. And so what does this look like if you want to think about a specific example? Well, I don't know if you were thinking this morning of waking up and thinking about Dharwad, but I want you to think about Dharwad. Dharwad is in the Bombay Presidency. What's the Bombay Presidency? The Bombay Presidency is a province that snakes its way all the way down the western coast from Gujarat until you hit almost Kerala. And what you see in black, encased in this little square box, is the district of Dharwad. And it's Kannada, or according to the colonial census, Canarese-speaking district, and that's a Dravidian language. And so as you look at on the left-hand panel at the districts that surround Dharwad, you're going to see that they have dark green colors, which dark here means less. Dark here means less linguistic distance from Dharwad. And as you move south, you'll see that you get into lighter shades of green, but they're still fairly dark. You get into regions that speak languages like Tamil, you get into regions that speak languages like Malayalam, and they're still Dravidian. They are more similar to Kannada than are other languages to the north. And so if you go instead north, what you're going to see is that you go from dark green to light green pretty suddenly, pretty starkly, and that's because you move into Marathi-speaking Indo-European region where the language is much different. I haven't told you yet how we're going to think about or how we're going to measure migration. But if you look at the picture on the right, you'll see kind of a similar pattern. This is going to be a measure of outmigration from Darwin and where those migrants go. And if you follow the pattern to the north, you'll find that, again, there's a discontinuity in outmigration from Darwin. Once you hit the boundary between the Dravidian language and the Indo-European language, you don't hit a political boundary, but you do see purple dropping off to become light gray, and that's meant to symbolize a pretty dramatic decline in the rate of migration, one that doesn't peter off as dramatically as you move south. You'll also notice in gray, we've got way more data on language than we do on migration. This is a bit of a frustrating feature of the colonial census. It's not going to be one of the 2001 data. So let's say a little bit about the migration data. In the 1901 colonial censuses, we don't have microdata. They did tally sheets. Those tally sheets no longer survived. And even if we had the tally sheets, they are not individual enumerations the way you might be used to seeing if you've worked with, say, American or British census data. In 1901, what we instead have is, for this district, the number of people living here who were born in this district, and who were born in that district, and who were born in the other district. And that allows us to have crosstabs between resident district and birthplace. Now, what's frustrating about these data, and you could see it in the previous map, is that we don't know birthplace if it's outside of the province all of the time. Sometimes we do, most of the time we don't. If somebody is in Darwin and they were born in the United Provinces of Agra and Oud, we'd only know that they're from the United Provinces. We wouldn't know which specific district that they are actually from Lucknow. In 2001, the data are much better. The publicly available data are not that much better. Indeed, in 2001 census data that you can just get from the Indian government website, you never know the district of origin for an out-of-state migrant. But Clément-Imbert was able to get from the census office much more detailed data that allows us to have almost the pairwise, the full pairwise migration matrix for all of India for all districts, with the caveat that this isn't going to be by place of birth, it's going to be by where you were living 10 years ago. That's slightly different. We can also use the census data for robustness. It's not our baseline because the census data, at least in the present day, is less complete. Although I've written this down as if we have it by sex only in the present, we actually know males and females among the migrant population in both time periods. We're going to construct two different measures of migration. The first, that's going to be suitable for a Poisson gravity-style regression, is just going to be counts. The number of migrants from origin O who are living in destination D. The second is going to be something that you see in the migration literature, which is going to be the ratio of migrants to stayers. And so if you know the number of migrants who go from O to D, that's in the numerator. If you know the number of people in O who stay in O, that's in the denominator. We're going to take the log of that, and because there are some pairs where there's no zeros, we're going to follow what Atsera and Piatkova did and put the log of 1 plus on the top, or the 1 plus on both the top and the bottom before taking logs. If you're worried about the Chen and Rothko-Triek, that's why we also have count data, but this bottom measure is going to play nice with modern regression discontinuity estimators that the top count data model wouldn't. What are we going to control for? Everything. Okay, what we're going to control for is a wide range of measures of dissimilarity between District O and District D that might correlate with their dissimilarities in language. This is going to be somewhat non-trivial. The maps that exist of the colonial districts are often fairly imprecise. I've hand geocoded the map from the 1931 census myself, and I can tell you that some of the little princely states are small little circles and that these are very imprecise. The gazetteer maps often have poor boundaries and capture a single point in time when the set of districts keeps changing in any colonial census. That's also why it's very hard to do panel regressions. The districts keep changing. So what we've done is taken the best maps that exist of every census year, and instead of trying to reconstruct those polygon shape files exactly, we've started with sub-districts in the present day and said that this colonial district is best approximated by this collection of modern-day sub-districts. That hopefully allows us to have less measurement error when computing things like how suitable is this district for growing wheat, or how rugged is this district. This is something that we go into more detail in my Missing Women paper with Cora and with Bishnu. So there's going to be some things we can compute ourselves in GIS about the distances between these districts. What's their just kind of great circle distance? Are they neighbors? Are they in the same province? Or in the post-colonial data, are they in the same state? If you don't like using great circle distance, we're also going to be able to use the transportation networks that exist and travel times in order to tell you distance, in order to tell you cost distance between two districts. Everything else we're going to construct using mostly raster data. So are these districts dissimilar in elevation? Are they dissimilar in ruggedness? Do they have dissimilar temperatures, dissimilar precipitations? Are they both equally prone to malaria? Have they got equally good land? And what can they grow? There's 15 crops that are kind of the main crops in India. We get suitability for these measures from the FAO. If you're worried that shocks drive migration, and so I leave an area if we have a drought, but I don't leave to an area that also has a drought, we can look at whether they have rainfall and temperature correlations over the 20th century that are positive or negative or null. Summary statistics are mostly for completeness. The one thing you can see here is that we've got fewer observations in the 1901 census than we do in the colonial or in the modern day, in the present day census, just because we lack so much migration from out of province districts. Instead, we know out of provinces. So we're going to have two empirical approaches. The first is going to be a gravity type model in which we're going to use a Poisson. And so we're going to model the expected number of migrants from origin O living in destination D as an exponential of a few things. The main one that we're going to care about is the linguistic distance between origin O and destination D. That is, how dissimilar are the languages, majority languages, in O and D. We're going to control for the distance between them, geodesic distance, usually in log form. We're going to control for a dummy for whether they're neighbors. We're going to have a fixed effect for origin districts. We're going to have a fixed effect for destination districts. And we're going to control for several other measures of geographic dissimilarity that I told you about on the previous slide. We're going to use PPML, HDFE, because these are counts and because there's lots of fixed effects. And we're going to do two-way clustering by both origin and by destination. In the regression discontinuity, modern RDD estimators don't play nice with count data, though I'm happy to be corrected on that point. And so what we're going to use is a different measure for the outcome variable, one that comes out of the migration literature. It's the ratio of migrants to stayers, where we add 1 to migrants and we add 1 to stayers because there are some zeros in the numerator. And we're going to take logs, partly because that fits and partly because that's standard in the literature. And the rest of the specification is going to be a little bit different, because you have to think about there as being two natural experiments here. One of migrants in north of the Indo-European boundary trying to decide how far to move south, and of migrants from south of the boundary trying to decide how far to move north. And so we're going to think of there as being two border experiments here as well. So the main right-hand side variable is going to be whether you're in the other region. If this destination is in the Indo-European region, if the origin is Dravidian. We're going to control for the distance between these two districts. Again, generally geodesic distance, and following the modern RDD literature, we're going to start with the baseline of local linear polynomials. We're going to have border experiment fixed effects, and we're going to have a dummy for whether these are in the same province. To my knowledge, these new RDD estimators don't play nice with two-way clustering, so we're going to cluster standard errors by destination, at least in the baseline. So this is kind of the thought experiment we have in mind. I want you to think about Dharwad again. If you're in Dharwad, you could move to Bijapur, which is also Dravidian speaking, or for only a few miles more, you could move to Sholapur, which isn't. Flip that around. Imagine you're in Thana, just outside of modern Mumbai. You could move to Sholapur, which is also Marathi speaking, or you could move to Bijapur for a few miles more, but change the language. And what we're basically going to ask is whether migration falls off a cliff when crossing that blue to yellow boundary. You're looking probably over at the right-hand side of the figure and asking, well, why don't you do the same thing with the Sino-Tibetan versus Indo-European boundary? And that's because of this, that the Indo-European Dravidian boundary cuts not only through the Bombay Presidency, it also cuts through the Deccan Plateau. It's not a geographic boundary. And in the appendix, I can show you lots of geographic balance tests that show you that these districts are similar across the boundary. If I were to do this for Sino-Tibetan languages, on the other hand, you'd end up finding that, yeah, the boundary is the mountains, and all the balance tests would look terrible. These aren't balanced. There are clear costs of physically crossing that boundary, and so we're not going to use that RDD in the baseline. Okay, so I'm going to show you our 1901 results first, and going left to right in this table, what I'm going to show you is that first, if you just remember, this is a Poisson estimation, regress the number of migrants on the linguistic distance between origin and destination, while controlling for nothing else except for whether these are in the same province, you'll get a coefficient of negative 2.69. I'll tell you how to think about that magnitude later. But obviously, districts that speak more dissimilar languages are further from each other. And so you throw in log distance as a control, and you throw in a dummy for whether the origin and destination physically border each other, and you'll get that the coefficient falls notably compared to not having any controls at all. If we then add in either geographic characteristics of the origin and destination, or if we have their geographic dissimilarity and fixed effects for origin and destination, the coefficient settles down to about negative 0.47. What does that mean? Well, in a Poisson world, if we were going to go from having the same majority language, we both speak Hindi, to speaking two unrelated languages, migration would fall by about 38%. Now let's look at the regression discontinuity. First off, we can zoom out and I can just show you the whole country. And I can show you that the share of people in a destination district that speak the same language as the majority language in the origin district is pretty high as you move away from the origin district and towards the linguistic boundary. But once you hit the linguistic boundary, the number of common language speakers falls off a cliff. And so if you're wondering, do language boundaries exist? Not in the sense that you go from 100% of speakers in this district to 0% of speakers in that district, but you can absolutely see common language falling off a cliff once you cross the boundary. What does that look like in terms of migration? Well, the further you get from a district and the more you go towards the boundary, sure, migration from origin to destination falls. However, once you cross the boundary into the other language zone, you can see a discontinuity in the outmigration rate, after which it continues to fall with further distance. Now, that's not our baseline RDD specification. This is our baseline RDD specification. And so if you focus in on the optimal bandwidth, you again find that if you cross the linguistic boundary, the number of common language speakers falls. And if you cross the linguistic boundary, the number of migrants from origin O to destination D falls visibly. If you want to see that as a table, it looks like this. And so again, the coefficient is going to get smaller if we add more measures of how dissimilar districts are, but it's going to settle down in the full specification with controls and fixed effects to a number that, in meaning, is again very similar. The ITT effect here is similar to the coefficient that we get when looking at the when looking in the gravity model. Now that is the ITT effect. If we were to do a fuzzy RDD design, one where you basically take this as to be instrumented for and this as to be your outcome variable, we get a bigger late than you do out of the ITT, and that's not surprising. This is what happens when you cross a boundary between language families. I will show you later on that it is those big differences between language families that drives the results that we find. Okay, now what happens if you jump ahead to 2001? The table's organized in the same way. You start off with no controls, you add a control for distance, you add an indicator for whether they're dummies, you add more measures of geography or geographic dissimilarity, and you add dummies for whether origin and destination are in the same state now, not province. There's more states today, and you can see we've got a lot more observations because we've got the pairwise matrix mostly of origins and destinations. But it settles down to a number that's negative 0.442. How do you think about that? Well, you think about that as a percentage decline due to moving from completely related to completely unrelated that is really similar to what we find in the colonial period. Now, you might ask me, where's your RDD for 2001? And I'll tell you, it's in the appendix. We don't want to focus on it because in 1956, they redrew these boundaries. It didn't really make sense for the Bombay presidency to snake its way all the way down the western coast, cutting through several languages. And so now you get provinces like Maharashtra or Kannada. And so you have confounding boundaries. We want to take the 2001 RDD a little less seriously because now crossing a linguistic boundary also means crossing a political boundary. But if you want to see it, the numbers we get are relatively similar. Now, you might think that there's other reasons you don't want to compare the 1901 and 2001 numbers. So it could be that India's gotten a lot smaller than it used to be. That's fine. We can do the 1901 results in the set of districts that ended up in later India. You might worry that a lot of migrants came because of partition and got moved around, and that changed the set of languages, but also changed the number of people who are living outside of their district of birth. We can throw out states that border other countries. We can also find the geographic units that have remained relatively unchanged over the course of a century and use that set of districts in our origin destination pairs. And across these, we get relatively similar magnitudes. So I've shown you this. Then we can kick the results around. We can kick the results around a fair amount. And so what do you do with data in 1901 that's reported at the province level, or even more frustratingly at things like rest of Bombay presidency level? And there's different assumptions we can make about how to impute migration across districts or whether to throw them out or not. That doesn't really change the results. We can use ordinary least squares instead of a Poisson. We can use the probability or the expected distance between the languages of two random people selected from each district, knowing that past migration might confound that measure, but it does allow us to take into account the full spectrum of languages spoken in origin and destination. Or we can throw out the trees entirely. We can use instead lexico-statistical distance, something Andrew Dickens has done a lot of work on. So take the Swadesh list. What's the Swadesh list? There's a list of words that are pretty common to every language in the world. Every language has a word for bone. Every language has a word for blood. And linguists have coded these words into a common phonetic alphabet. And so the number of edits you have to make to take this word in this language and make it equal to this word in this language is a measure of how dissimilar those words are. Now, average that across all the word pairs while correcting for the fact that some languages just have a lot of O's and other languages have a lot of clicks. And you can come up with a measure of how dissimilar languages are phonetically. That's going to give us similar results to the baseline, but we're not going to use it in the baseline because far fewer languages have been coded into this alphabet than have been classified into trees. Geodesic distance is simple, but it might not truly measure travel costs. But we now have shapefiles of the railway, and we have shapefiles of rivers and other forms of transport. And so we can come up with time-based distance measures instead. And if you're worried that we picked one colonial year and one post-colonial year, we can use the 2011 census, we can use the 1921 census, and we get relatively similar results. Why don't we use the 2021 census? To my knowledge, it is not yet available. So why does language matter for migration? We're going to focus on a few possibilities, and I'm not going to show you everything that we've done, but our ultimate answer is that we're going to think this is about language qua language. We're going to think about this as language mattering because of the cost of communication. Now, you might think that language is just a proxy for other cultural differences. I don't want to move to a place where they eat wheat if I'm used to eating rice. I don't want to move to a place where they practice patrilineal inheritance when I want my daughters to be able to inherit. So we can go out and measure differences in culture. One of the differences in culture that exists in India is caste. And for an appendix table, this was a stunning amount of work because they will tell you the number of people of each jati, each kind of not Varna level, there's 4 of them, jati level, there's thousands of them that exist in a given district. And because one subcaste might have a different name in this district than it does in this district, there's a crosswalk table that we've also had to digitize in order to harmonize these names across districts. Then we can ask, what's the probability that a randomly selected person from this district is from a different caste than a randomly selected person from this district? And the answer is actually going to be more than 90% for most district pairs. Because sure, Bengali Brahmins and Tamil Brahmins both exist, but a lot of castes are pretty regional. And so if we control for caste distance, we do make the coefficient of linguistic distance smaller, but it doesn't go away. If we were to control for religion, well, you probably already saw where this was going. Not very much is going to happen. There's a lot of Hindus in the north. There's a lot of Hindus in the south. And Bengal has a lot of both Muslims and Hindus. And so controlling for religious distance by asking what's the probability that a random person from this district and a random person from this district speak different languages, that's not going to do very much. What about other measures of culture? Well, those become a little bit harder to code, but thankfully to recent work by Walter, the Ethnographic Atlas covers a lot more South Asian societies than it did 10 years ago. And so we can measure things like, do they practice matrilineal inheritance? Do they have different postpartum sex taboos? What shape are their houses? And we can create an index of the dissimilarity between 2 districts in these ethnographic measures of culture, controlling for them doesn't do all that much. Now, could this be not about language qua language, but about having a set of speakers that exist in a district that facilitate chain migration? Does the stock of migrants explain away the effect of language? No, but that's hard to measure. We had to go out and get the 1983 NSSO, in which they actually asked people, how long have you been there? That lets us construct stocks and flows based on carving new migrants into flows and old migrants into stocks. If we were to do that, and we could either make the division at 5 years or at 10 years, Sure, the stock of migrants is a good predictor of the flow of migrants, but even conditional on the stock of migrants, language continues to be a barrier to migration. Could this all be about migration for marriage? I won't move where I can't find a husband that speaks my language. We don't think that's what's driving it, because if we were to break up the results by sex and do this in 1901 or 2001 for male migrants or for female migrants, you get really similar coefficients in the male sample and in the female sample. So we don't think that's what's driving it. What we think is driving this is things like is the actual ability to communicate. And so first off, we can show you that where does the language effect bind? It binds most when the destination has higher wages than the origin. Now, this is going to be a bit fuzzy because there's not that much granular data on wages in colonial India. Prices and wages in India only report it for something like 70 markets. But in that sample, if the destination wage is higher than the origin wage, that's where we see linguistic distance being a barrier. And it's particularly when the wage difference is in the high quartile, in the fourth quartile of the wage difference, that we see language being a barrier. Why do we think this is about communication rather than culture? Well, it's also the case that it's the highest levels of language difference that drive the results. So instead of us putting linguistic distance on the right-hand side, what if we put a dummy for your languages are from different families? Your languages are different but have one branch in common. Your languages are different and have two branches in common. So you can think of different families as the distance between Hindi and Tamil, or the difference between English and Cantonese. Whereas if you were going to look at one branch, that would be something like the difference between Hindi and English, or something like the difference between Cantonese and Burmese. If you're going to start looking at two branches, you start looking at things like the difference between Farsi and Hindi, or the difference between German and English, or the difference between like Cantonese and Hakka Chinese. Whereas if you're going to start looking at three branches, you're thinking about things like the difference between English and Scots, or the difference between Hindi and Punjabi, or the difference between Cantonese and like Min Chinese. Once you get further down, my Cantonese and English metaphors break down because the languages get more similar than exists in either of those examples. And you start thinking about things like the difference between Hindi and Haryanvi, Hindi and Bhojpuri, until you start reaching things like Hindi and Urdu, which are actually mutually intelligible. I've watched it happen. So it's really where they inhibit communication that you see these differences. Lastly, in the modern day census, they actually ask about languages spoken, not just mother tongue. And if you were to look at languages spoken and run a horse race, you would find that it is the languages spoken rather than, and the differences between them, rather than the differences in mother tongues that drives dissimilarities in migration flows. Now, that's not driven by lots of people speak English, and so once you account for English, districts become more similar. Still, only in 2001, something like 10-12% of the Indian population spoke English even as a second language. Rather, this is going to start being about some of the bigger languages, things like Hindi, things like Bengali, get spoken as a second language by a lot of people. Could this be could this be something that either regional languages have fixed or that rising education has fixed? Here, we don't find evidence of that. If I were to look at language, and sorry, haven't brought the tables. If I were to look at literacy, results aren't that different for literate migrants and illiterate migrants. We have microdata from 1983 to do that. If we were to look in 1901, the best we can do is look at whether the origins are high literacy or low literacy. The coefficient of linguistic distance is pretty similar between the two of them. If I were to ask about whether not does my district speak a different language than this district, but rather is the official language of my state different than the official language of that state, Official languages don't seem to do all that much. And that's not a surprise. You look at work by Taran Jain, and people who are in the wrong state because they're a linguistic minority relative to the state that's now structured around that language, they tend to do worse in school. They seem to have barriers to the adoption of the state language. So what do I think we've told you? I think we've told you that language is a barrier to migration. I think we've told you that language has been a barrier to migration for a long time, and it hasn't diminished as a barrier to migration over a long time. And so you should care about this as an economist. Something that stops labor from going where its return is highest is a misallocation problem. And so one of the sources of potentially too low migration within India is the country's linguistic diversity. This barrier, whether it's cultural or whether it's communicative, or whether it's about communication, hasn't diminished despite actual government efforts that you'd think would work against it, or despite economic development that you think would work against it. And so I think what we tell you is that nation building is hard, and reducing barriers between languages within a country is difficult. That's what I have.
Thank you. Thank you very much, James, for the truly insightful presentation. And may I remind our audience again, and if you have any questions, just please drop them in the Q&A box. Okay, so now I'd like to invite Mark to share his comments on the presentation. Mark, over to you.
Yes, thank you. Let me also share my screen and then make this full. Yes, okay. Okay, great. Yeah, so I will briefly discuss the paper by James and his co-authors. So I will first just give a very brief summary, and then I'll talk about some points and some questions I have concerning like interpretation, some mechanisms, and also some takeaways in a way, like what made some future research do as well. So not just restricted to this paper. So I think, well, we're all familiar with the paper now. So just to give a brief summary again. So James and his co-authors look at this question about, well, what are the differences or how do the linguistic differences act as a barrier to internal migration? And does it persist over time, over this century? And they use this district pair data from India in 1901 and 2001. And they combine this gravity-style framework with an RD design along this boundary of these major language families. And the main finding is that, well, this linguistic distance is very important. It negatively affects migration, both in the past and nowadays. So we can think of there being this type of persistent linguistic tax on migration. And then the mechanism explaining this is going through communication and information frictions. So I think, yeah, this is a very strong paper. I liked reading it a lot. I learned a lot as well. So I think they give an ambitious long-run comparison. So they use the same conceptual estimate in both 1901 and 2001. And by doing that, they can present evidence on the century-scale persistence pact. And they also used very careful measurements. So this graded linguistic distance rather than just a common language dummy, for example. And also in the later year, they can look at these subsidiary languages. And I think the RD gives an important credibility upgrade beyond the gravity model. So to address confounding, and it's not, as James was saying, it's this main language border they look at in the main paper, but they also look at this many borders variant in an appendix. And I think that's also, and they find consistent results of this border negatively affecting migration. And as you saw just now, the many robustness check is transparently done. And I think indeed it matters. So language may be a durable friction in this spatial labor market adjustment. So that can have all kinds of effects that we also care about, like integration, like structural change. It may slow those types of developments. So that's my basic summary in a way of the paper. And I also have some questions, some further thoughts. So one is about how do we interpret, let's say, the beta. So what does beta capture? So we can think of it as a general language friction. So it's not necessarily limited to one narrow channel. And perhaps the fact that there's no attenuation over this 100 years may lead us to not interpret it as just the pure communication costs. So maybe we can also move towards a broader interpretation. So is this linguistic stacks primarily just about this pre-move information? So do people not know about job opportunities elsewhere and what they can earn there, for example? Or could it also be related to post-move integration? So finding appropriate housing, getting access to local public services, for example. So there can be these ongoing integration costs even after people have made a move. So I think this is important because there are policy implications that would depend on the mechanism. So if it's really just about pre-move information, then maybe a translation tool would help in attenuating this effect of a linguistic boundary. But that type of tool may help less if it's, say, related to settlement or outgroup discrimination based on language. So next to that, I was also thinking about the identification. So we can think perhaps about these language borders as potential bundles and zones. So there is this bundling risk with the regression discontinuity that next to the language changing, perhaps there are these other deep discontinuities that are bundled at the border. So maybe kinship systems change or land institutions change, for example, and they may not be fully captured by geography. So the authors use a wide range of geographic controls, and they also check for balance, but it may be helpful to also look for a non-geographic balance at the cutoff. And I think what may be a good addition next to the many borders experiment is to also look at placebo borders. So if you, let's say, would draw some random borders yourself, then you would expect to find no effect of this linguistic distance on migration. And so next to that, I was also thinking that, well, linguistic borders, they could be zones rather than sharp lines. And if that is the case, so let's say if people very close to the border are somewhat able to communicate with each other, have this cross-border communication, then maybe the RD gives a lower bound estimate. So one way to handle that would be to use a donut RD. So basically exclude the areas very close to the border. But I'm not sure if that's exactly possible because maybe the districts, where people live based on their district or where they come from based on their district, maybe they're too large. But if it is possible, that will be one way of checking this. And then you may expect the estimate to actually increase in absolute size. Now, next to that, onto the mechanisms. So the authors argue it's really about these impaired communication and information flows, for example, about job market opportunities that reduce migration. But as I mentioned just now, there could be this broader bundle of, let's say, settlement frictions or discrimination or social integration costs. So it's about these ongoing costs of settling, let's say, of integrating somewhere, not only about pre-move information. So that would, in a way, broaden the interpretation from, let's say, mainly about labor information to labor info and integration and institutions. And maybe that's also consistent with the fact that they find no strong attenuation with education, with official languages, because there could be these binding non-information frictions in a way that relate to the linguistic border. So maybe discrimination plays a role as well, outgroup language-based discrimination. Next, I was thinking about, well, a potential extension that could be useful, or maybe for another research. So we can think about these language barriers as being non-linear across skills. So perhaps high-skilled jobs require higher fluency to be productive. So next to these language barriers, let's say reducing the overall size of migration, the number of migrants, it could also change the composition of migration. So basically who moves, who migrates. So it could lead to migrant selection. So perhaps this linguistic distance particularly taxes communication-intensive human capital. So then we would expect there to be this larger wedge for, let's say, skilled and service jobs rather than for manual work. Now, perhaps there are some ways to test it with the data, but I'm not sure the data availability. So one could be to estimate, let's say, the gravity equation separately by education and occupation bins. And another way could be to, let's say, interact the linguistic distance variable with the destination service sector share. And that may show that indeed this effect of this linguistic boundary is larger when the service sector is larger. Now, this may not be very important in 1901. Maybe the service sector is very small in all these places, but that may play more of a role when we think about, well, what are the, let's say, the effects of these types of boundaries nowadays, and what may they be related to? Now, next to that, related to the policy implications. So if we think of language as a mobility friction, then transport infrastructure alone won't fully integrate labor markets. So then we can think, well, what interventions would be effective? So would it be these multilingual job information portals? So people do have this pre-move information about opportunities. So that could be perhaps cheaply accomplished nowadays. Or would there be targeted language training, let's say, targeted to people who are more likely to move and who may also benefit more from achieving full functional bilingualism, for example? Or could there still be a role for easing administrative barriers to migrants, so perhaps making public services portable across space, access to those services? And next to that, what I basically want to conclude with are just some other questions I was thinking about. So one, in the 1901 setting, to what extent was this internal migration shaped by unfree or semi-coerced labor institutions, like, for example, indentureships or penal contracts that we know played a sizable role as well back in the early 1900s and the late 1800s, and may this be related to, let's say, recruiters and these types of networks that they use to recruit people to migrate across for job opportunities, and perhaps those networks are also based on these linguistic boundaries in a way that they could be language-specific networks, but I'm not sure if that played a role. And next to that, we can ask, well, what outcomes beyond migration should also show these types of language gradients? And that would be consistent with what James and his co-authors find in this paper. So it could be, for example, price integration, right? So James has another paper on that, basically finding that type of evidence. Could be wage convergence, but it could also be the spread of ideas or support for political parties nowadays. And yeah, presumably there would be this effect of this linguistic boundary on these outcomes as well, just by the fact that less people are moving. So let's say the ideas are also less converging as well. Now, another link that I was thinking about for the modern day outcomes, what about this idea of premature deindustrialization, or how does that interact with that? So if developing economies nowadays skip straight to this type of communication intensive services, or at least they're less able to benefit, to move in towards, let's say, higher employment in manufacturing, then is this linguistic diversity a structural drag on growth for countries like India? And related to that, then we can ask, well, what would it take for the language friction effect to actually attenuate over time? So the authors find it doesn't attenuate over time from 1901 and comparing it to 2001. But that then leads us to ask, well, it's important, so how could we shrink it? And has it perhaps shrunk in the, let's say, the 25 years that have happened since the 2001 data, with the spread of the internet and the mobile phones and translation apps that make communication perhaps easier? So yes, I'll finish here. So again, I really enjoyed the paper, and I think it's a very strong paper. So thank you.
Thank you, Mark. And James, do you want to take some time to respond to some of the points Mark mentioned?
So is it better that I answer his questions and then answer the ones that I can see in the Q&A? Or is it better that I do it the other way around, so that if I run out of time
it's up
answering
to you.
his questions?
Okay, it's up to
I'll start with the Q&A, because I've got 2 pages of notes here, and I don't want to prevent the people who ask questions.
Yeah.
So Why not use a log format in the gravity model? That's technical. India is a low internal migration country. And so there's a lot of district pairs where there are no migrants from origin O to destination D. And so in a world where logs with zeros are now known to have some problems, my reading, which could be wrong, is that the preferred method is to use a count data estimator. And if we're going to throw in a bunch of fixed effects, a pseudo-Poisson maximum likelihood estimator with fixed effects is probably the right one. Are we measuring these district language measures by first language spoken? Absolutely. That's our baseline. That's what we have. It's mother tongue. In the colonial data, there's basically nothing we can do about that because that's what's recorded in the census. In the present, yeah, it does look as though language is spoken if you recode the district's main language as the one that's most widely spoken rather than the one that's most widely mothered. That's what drives the migration effect. Scrolling up, can I capture whether an individual is moving from Tamil Nadu to a big city with a diaspora? So first off, we tried to do that in the 1983 NSSO data, and even controlling for diaspora language matters. But over and above that, we're worried that doing that in our baseline would lead to reverse causation. A bunch of people moved to Delhi speaking Tamil. Now the expected linguistic distance between a random person in Delhi and in Vellore are smaller. And so we don't want to have that reverse causation. Therefore, it's not our baseline. We do it for robustness. The question about sharing the video is
We are going
not
to.
one I can do, but I am, I think, my own first Google result, and my email address should be available there. So that's what I can see in the Q&A. So let me move on to Mark's comments, and I will also say, if you send me the slides, that would be amazing.
Yes, I will do that.
And so you're not the first person to ask us why the effect hasn't gotten bigger or hasn't gotten smaller over the course of a century. And I think there's a few ways to think about this. One is remember, it's a Poisson. Think of these in percentage terms. If migration is higher, you can have more migration, but still a 38% barrier or 36% barrier. So this should be thought of in proportional terms. And once we start talking about proportionality, we think about whether language as a barrier can be replaced with other technologies, or if, on the other hand, as we get more service sector intensive or more education intensive, it's compounded by these other changes in the economy. The other is, okay, I know a fair number of people from India. You know a fair number of people from India. They're all really secular and have PhDs in economics. And so the typical Indian that we know might not be reflective of the levels of English speaking, of multilingualism, of education that you would see when you're thinking about migrants going to work on a railway or going to work on construction in the urban sector. Lastly, my writing is terrible. Okay. Policy implications. I have a rant. I'm always deeply skeptical of papers that evaluate policies that they have not randomized. And so I don't want to go out and say much about this policy would work or that policy would work. The question I frequently get is, well, why don't we just teach Hindi in schools everywhere? And I tell you, the Chief Minister Stalin of Tamil Nadu will tell you that no, that's an impingement in Southern culture. That's like going up to an Englishman and saying, you know, Europe would work so much better if we all spoke German. And so I think what I'm most useful for here is telling you that, yeah, we can see the redrawing of state boundaries on linguistic lines. We can see a rise in education, and we can see attempts to increase Hindi, and that hasn't done much. So if anything, what we can tell you is the policies that haven't worked rather than which policies would work. And so you ask about technology. And so I'd be fascinated to see if the results go away in the 2021 census. Once smartphones between 2011 and 2021 become pretty widespread, and even dumb phone, cell phone ownership goes up. And if you want to give me $100,000 to run that RCT, I'd be happy to take it. But it's not something we can say that much about now. So what does the RD bundle together? It doesn't bundle together religion. We know that. And so for the most part, when you do an RD, balance tests, you tend to only put exogenous predetermined characteristics on the left-hand side. And we've done that with the kitchen sink of geography. We checked it for religion because somebody pointed out to us that Cholapur has an unusually high number of Muslims, and I should have known that from the poor. But other measures of culture, yeah, we can do the balance test. I can't promise you that the results will look sensible. We haven't done them yet, simply because sometimes we have to measure culture using language. That what we know in the ethnographic atlas is the culture of the Punjabis. And so you'd expect culture to change. The question is whether cultural distance changes more at the language boundary than language distance does. It could be fuzzy. I liked the idea of placebo borders. That's absolutely implementable. So are there zones rather than sharp lines? I come into this as a recovering Africanist, and my instinct is that there's actually sharp lines. There's kind of a line you will often hear in the African studies literature that ethnic boundaries are fake and people live everywhere and they're porous. But then you go out and actually look in survey data and ask people, what's your ethnic group? What language do you speak? And in geocoded data, you can find that the percentage of Yoruba speakers drops off a cliff once you leave the Yoruba speaking zone. And so these boundaries, yeah, it doesn't go from 100% to 0%, but it goes from like 80% to 20%. These are meaningful boundaries, and this makes sense. If language is like Tinder or the railway, I want to be on the same one that everybody else is on, then there's network externalities that lead to convergence of having, you adopt the language that is in the place that you are and are interacting with, or if you don't, your kids do. And so over the course of centuries, you get areas where real linguistic boundaries can form even on a flat plane. But this is testable. So the demographic and health surveys ask language, and recent waves are geocoded. I could simply look at whether this boundary at a finer level than the district is a real boundary rather than a gradient. I haven't checked whether there's language in Shrug. I don't off the top of my head think there is, but my intuition is that I would find these boundaries rather than them being an artifact of going across districts. Alternative mechanisms. I'm half with you here. We're thinking about this not just as communication to get a job. We're thinking about this as going to the doctor, going to the market, or as you say, dealing with the bureaucrat and dealing with the landlord. And so those are aspects of communication that we think are part of our story, but we don't have colonial data on landlords. We have colonial data, or at least not on the apartment renting you a flat landlord sense. We have data on wages, and so that's what we're able to use. But discrimination is an interesting one. If I'm discriminated against because I'm different, that could be a lot of types of difference. That could be because of my color, my caste, my religion, my culture. But those are all, three of those are things that we actually have, and we have in the colonial data, and that don't explain away the result. And so if the only thing left that I'm being discriminated against is language, then it's still communication. I struggle to communicate, and the people around me don't like the fact that I struggle to communicate. Is this different depending on education and occupation? We've looked at this by rural-urban and rural-rural, and we find that, sure, it limits rural-urban, but also limits rural-rural migration. However, if we wanted to look more at specific occupations, that becomes easier in the present day than it does in the colonial census. We've only coded the occupation level data for the British India, which would cut our sample down, particularly in the pairwise. And it's a lot of categories that are costly to digitize and don't map into modern ISIC codes or modern ILO codes or into NIC codes, frankly. But we can try. We show results by education in the colonial data, and it doesn't seem to be dissimilar on those grounds. Forced migration. So we don't have Natal in the data. We don't have the Andaman and Nicobar Islands in our data. So it isn't the prisoners and it isn't the indentured migrants. The within India semi-coercive labor systems that exist, we think would probably bias the results against us, in that the women who go pick tea in Assam are not generally Assamese speaking, and yet they go there anyways. And then prices and wages. So thank you. Yes, we absolutely have another paper on prices. When working on that paper, we looked at wages. We didn't find anything, but there's not as much wage data. So can I tell you that that's a precise null, or can I tell you that we just don't have that many districts with wages? It becomes harder for me to say anything. I do know the literature on the railways has found more price convergence than wage convergence because of the railways. On other outcomes, I'm moving away from political economy, but if others want to look at the effects of language on political support, that sounds like an awesome idea. The language data are already in the replication files for my price integration paper.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And we have a new question coming in from our PhD student here at HKU, Yu Chen. And he asks, given the persistent linguistic barriers to migration despite efforts in education and economic development, do you think these linguistic divides are actually a reflection of the state's limited capacity in promoting a unified national language, infrastructure development, and so on?
So for the most part, I'm going to say no, because we can still look at heterogeneity by the level of development that exists, and that varies within the sample. We can look at heterogeneity by travel costs, and that has variation that exists within the sample. The bit where I'd have to be more careful in an answer is in promoting language, in that there are people who have subsidiary languages. And it does look in the present day that the second, third language I speak does matter for my migration choices. We show you that. But the state's limited capacity in promoting a unified national language is part of why I don't like doing policy implications. You could absolutely imagine that the successful creation of a national language could lower migration barriers. And it could do a lot of other things too that this study does not evaluate, and has a lot of political economy implications that I understand are better handled by democracy than they are handled by a researcher.
Can I also ask a question here? I'm just wondering, for the 147 languages that you mentioned in India, they're very different, of course, in spoken language, but are there any just similarities if in writing they're actually being more understandable between all these languages, or they're even more different?
So in some cases, it's remarkable how many of the scripts derive from Sanskrit, and so so many of them to me look superficially similar. But that doesn't mean that if you're Gujarati speaking, you can read Bengali. Like Bengali and Oriya, I think, have the same script, but that doesn't mean that just because they have that nice line at the top, I can read all of them. And then you get to the south, and they start looking actually more like Southeast Asian languages in the scripts that they use.
Thank you. And I think that we can end with Professor Stephen Morgan's comment here, also in the Q&A box. And thanks, James, for a fascinating paper, and also Mark for the interesting observations and questions. And I think that we can wrap up here, that we are right on time. So a sincere thank you again to James, and also to Mark, and to all the, sorry, I think we have a final question here. If there are some, if James could recommend some books on India, maybe.
So, there's a million things that I should plug. The classic, I want to get into Indian economic history, would be to go read Tirthankar Roy's standard books on the economic history of India. But I also should really plug to you, my co-author and co-worker Bishnu Gupta has an edited volume that tells us how kind of the economic history that we as a group recognize has changed our understanding of economic history of India. And so I'll get all the titles wrong without Googling them, but A New Economic History of Colonial India. But she also has now a recent book on the economic history of India that is a monograph and solo authored that I recommend. Then let me suggest, if you want to find somebody who, okay, two more, sorry. I'll keep going over time. If you want to find a perspective that's probably going to disagree with everything I said today, Chinmay Tumbe has a book called India Moving, which is really colorful and really fun to read. And if you want to see just how difficult it is to get evidence going back into India's past, where these language differences came from, and the evidence we have and where it comes from, Tony Joseph's book, Ancient Indians. There you go. That's 4 books. That'll keep you busy for at least an afternoon.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, James. And also thank you so much, Mark. And before we close, let me also remind our audience that about our next QH webinar on the 12th of March, and we'll have a hybrid webinar, hybrid seminar that day. And we are very pleased to have Professor Andrew Sinclair with us to share his new research on Confucian clan and also insurance and banking in traditional China. Okay, so thank you very much again. Thank you for joining us today, and see you next time. Thank you. Thank you, James. Thank you, Mark. Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.